and welcome again to The Right Idea, your place to discuss the people, politics, and policies that drive Texas. I'm your co-host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, our Vice President of Policy, Derek Cohen. How are we doing today, Derek?
I gotta say, man, these allergies are not the greatest at the moment.
Welcome to Austin, right?
Yeah, hey, look on the bright side. If we have South by starting up tomorrow or starting up this Friday, at the very least, you're going to get an accurate representation of Austin when they come in, not this unmitigated, unseasonably temperate.
They'll understand that there's actually some cost other than the real cost of moving to Austin. So session's going. Are we getting some sleep? Are we too tired? Or are we ready for Sunny Day?
Ready for Sunny Day, absolutely, but not before we start passing some good critical items of conservative legislation, I'd say. And we're going to start seeing things on the floor starting, we already have things on the Senate Intent calendar.
Yeah.
So, it's here. We're doing it.
Well, and we're ready, we're rested, we're ready to go. And we're not allowed to complain in government, too. I mean, I found that now we're not technically a government agency, although we do work in public policy. But I always found that when I worked in government, there were 3 rules, which were you weren't allowed to make any money, you weren't allowed to have any fun, and you weren't allowed to do anything other than work. And if any of your constituents or for the office that you worked for or any taxpayer anywhere found out that you might be having a good time or doing something silly with, your Twitter feed or something like that, it was just like constant criticism, So anyway, so we'll keep our head down, we'll work hard, and we'll get through
Absolutely.
it all. So a little bit of housekeeping, of course. If you want to get in touch with Derek or I, we're, of course, out there on the Twitterverse, and we love your feedback. We love your ideas for show ideas, and we love your constructive criticism. And even if it's just funny and comments and criticisms, we're happy to take all of those as well. On Twitter, I am at RealBphil, and Derek is at Cohen at TPPF. So we'd love to hear from you as well. Shameless plugs. Definitely want to keep plugging the weekly newsletter that we have, where we've taken all of the various subjects that we work on and we put it together into one big email that comes out every Thursday. It's called The Post, and you can find that. You can sign up for that if you're not already on the list at texaspolicy.com/The Post. And then, of course, all of these episodes you can find right on our YouTube page. And, of course, with all of your major podcasting services, iTunes, Google Play, and such. So we have do a little show recap. We're going to have a very special in-depth this time. We're not going to necessarily break down an issue, and I'll explain that later, but we've got a separate interview that I did on a different podcast, which I wanted to feature for folks so they could watch that. On top topics, I think we're gonna go into, there were presidential candidates are, falling all over themselves to come to Texas. One potential big time presidential candidate was here in town over the last week. And of course, we had Vivek Ramaswamy, who was at a Texas Policy Summit. And then we've got, potentially even Greg Abbott or somebody. So it's, they're coming to Texas. So we talk about presidential politics for a little bit. Talk about some hackneyed attacks by the left. We'll get into some of that as well and see how far we can get. But, of course, we always start our show with Derek's update, our Lege-Land update. And you said that we've got some bills, flying through. We've got real legislation being submitted and committees getting together and cats and dogs and all the things. So tell us what's going on up at the Capitol.
Well, specifically, it bears mentioning, we've talked about the 60-day window a lot of times here on the show. And so what that essentially is a constitutional prohibition that non-emergency items can't be substantively advanced prior to 60 days. Well, it's here. That 60 days is up on Friday. And also coming with that is the filing deadline. So long story short, what happens is Friday's going to come, and at 6 p.m., every non-local bill essentially needs to be filed, needs to be in the hopper, or it doesn't exist. Now, does that mean that some idea that's not in some bill somewhere is now completely banned from getting to the floor? Absolutely not. The only time that something is truly dead is after Sunny Day. But that being said, we are actually seeing, like I said, things on the intent calendar now. So one of the items on the intent calendar actually were things that we had written about before. We talked, with some consternation about the federal push post-Uvalde, about how it was a profligate spending bill, didn't really do that much to address public safety. Not that a profligate spending bill out of D.C. is something worth writing home about. It seems to be, stop me if you heard this
every
one.
bill.
Exactly. But one of the things that we said that it did well was opening the NICS system for otherwise disqualifying information that might have come from a juvenile source, right? And so a lot of the upload systems that they have in the states don't necessarily have means of compatibility with that. This one of the bills going through right now that's, that would be under the school safety emergency item would fix that. It would streamline how certain issues that come up through our juvenile mental health courts or even juvenile courts can get into NICS. So that's actually a very good public safety bill that should be out of the Senate here momentarily.
Let's talk a little bit about the priority bills, and so that is obviously a subject that a lot of people watch. You had Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick put out his full list, his 1 through 30. Now there's not always legislation attached to those yet, but he basically tells you what his priorities are going into the legislative session. The House has and the Speaker has a different way of doing that. You talk a little bit about that, and maybe and talk about what the strategy perhaps would be behind doing something like that.
Sure, and to be honest with you, I mean, even though the Lieutenant Governor has enumerated 30 bills to be his priority items, and some of those still do not actually have text, or they don't have they don't actually have an author and that stuff designated. Now that means it's not going to happen between now and Friday at 6 p.m. No, it doesn't mean that. But what it means probably is speaks to the issues we identified before, is that Ledge Council is really, really behind the ball on this one through some fault of their own, through a lot of environmental difficulties as well. But needless to say, is getting something in and out of Ledge Council has been trying this year, much like it was last session as well. Now, that being said, we definitely had the subject matter for every single one of those 30. Whereas on the Speaker's side, when one filed, he declares it not an emergency item, but a priority item, usually by assigning a low bill number, even though we had the one about the library content standards for schools, kept its original filing bill number of 900. We usually see that a bill's filed and then it moves into one of those slots.
So that's kind of some of the sausage making. Maybe people didn't know. I didn't know that was a thing. I just assumed that the members that the leaders would have their bills,
right?
Members, and then they go crazy with their legislative. But you can move those bills into the priority bills. That's got to be a big win. I mean, it's kind of inside baseball, but that's got to be a really big win for the rank and file if the leader is moving the bill into one of the priority bills.
Absolutely, and I don't want to speak for the Speaker. I don't want to speak for the Speaker, but I think that it's a lot in the Senate. The Lieutenant Governor, definitely has a more cohesive vision of running a chamber with 31 members than I think it'd be possible for the Speaker to have with 149 other members. And so when it comes to everything from the prioritization and negotiation to for everything from the strategic to the tactical level, I think there's a lot more boxes to be checked for the Speaker than exist across the FOIA, just because it's just that much larger of a chamber. And in doing so, elevating a particular solution to a problem, might seem to steal focus from a different solution to a problem. And then are you engendering then any sort of discontent between those two members? Whatever the case may be, it's just a lot more harder to herd 149 cats than 31.
And by the time that this airs, and like you said, the filing deadline is Friday, which is obviously at the end of the week and after we record these podcasts, and so a lot of these questions will be answered by then. But because we're TPPF and we're contractually obligated to talk about school choice every 11 minutes, really there's a lot of anticipation about SB 8, which would be the vehicle for the parent empowerment bill. And so, what are you hearing behind the scenes at all about that bill? And are people getting geared up and ready to have the big debate, right, over this issue?
Well, I think it's coming. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. But I think
we're gonna find out on Friday. You know what, guys? Well, we're going to punt this one now.
LOL, JK.
Yeah, just kidding.
No.
Move on to property tax.
I was about to say, if you just, and listeners can go to our YouTube just to see the keynote addresses, both from the governor and lieutenant governor and
Speaker.
And Speaker. And I do not want to put words in anybody's mouth, But for those who wish to see school choice uncategorically fail without any sort of movement in that direction, it would be very deleterious for those individuals to start planning their summers at the moment. So that being said, I think that you're going to start seeing folks come to the table. I think the version that we're going to see on file is probably going to be, a very, very good version. But again, when you need, a majority of 149 votes and you need a majority of 31 votes, and of course the threshold to suspend the rules as well. There's going to need to be some negotiations, some conference. So will the bill that's filed be the one that passed? That I probably wouldn't say so.
Sure.
Will it still be, I think with what we're seeing out there and the momentum we see behind it, will it still be a very good bill? I'd feel absolutely confident that will be.
And then property tax, of course, is the other big issue. Actually seeing a lot of public debate, honestly,
Yes.
about that, about what's
Funny how it works, huh?
Yeah, a lot of public debate. Well, then there's always social media and Twitter, and you get members going back and forth, and lobbyists are hitting each other and slapping each other with flip flops or whatever they do.
Very Singapore Parliament.
But property tax, it feels like we're starting to coalesce around at least an idea of what that's going to look like. Certainly the number, but you're hearing a lot we mentioned last week. You're hearing a lot of this idea of structural reform,
Yes.
so that we're not back here in another 5 years dealing with these property tax bills. We want to get something done that is actually lasting.
Yeah, and you've heard again, if you just look from what was said from our main stage at TPS. We
Shameless plug number 4, I think.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I talked to Greg about getting paid by the plugs. No. I suppose you're a comms guy. It should be your job.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, but no, I mean, just again, I really love the format, the fact that we had the big three, because it allowed us really to give them a forum to say, this is what I want to accomplish this session. Mm-hmm. Now, the biggest thing specifically in property taxes is that we've seen that there is a schism. There is a divide in the idea between the House and the Senate. Now, a divide in the way of agreeing that something's a problem and disagreeing about the solution between the two chambers, that we just call that Thursday. That's not, there's dozens of items in which that happens every session. But the fact that we're out there, we're having those discussions, I'm confident in point say, will there be property tax relief this year? Yes. Will it be, sizable? Yes. Will it be the largest in Texas history? Very well may be. Mm-hmm. The question, though, again, is going to revolve around what is the mechanisms whereby that is delivered. And that is where, you mentioned the public debate. This is how it's supposed to happen.
Right.
This is how it's supposed to happen. And, there are advantages to the House plan. There are advantages to the Senate plan, and each have their disadvantages as well. And those are what need to be aired out in public.
And of course, all of the committee hearings are all streamed live, so people can watch. I literally watched the sausage being made on that. So, we could prognosticate about legislative twists and turns all day. But again, if you do have questions, I would just reach out to Derek on social media, because he's the guy behind the curtain sometimes and knows what's going on there. So if you haven't, it's kind of like like a fantasy football tips. Like everybody wants your tips, your political tips.
Patrick Mahomes is my lock of the week.
So we could talk about that all day. I want to get to some. We talk a lot about heavy policy issues, and that's kind of the point of this podcast, because we are a think tank. We want to talk about the ideas, and we don't really get into the politics a lot of times. But it is interesting, and so we want to we talk about the policies and politics that drive Texas, and certainly presidential politics is one of those things. We have a Democrat in office in the White House right now, which means it's an open floor essentially as to who the nominee is going to be, which makes the Republican side of things more exciting. And so every little thing that happens, whether it's Donald Trump tweeting something, or I guess he can't tweet, but Donald Trump saying something, or we're having Vivek Ramaswamy or Nikki Haley or whoever jump into the race, and then of course Ron DeSantis, who everybody says is one of the front runners. He of course was in Texas this last week. And he was here, obviously pitching, his book and things like that, but also kind of staking out his case for perhaps why he might jump into a race. And one of those things, is one of the things that really came out of the speech, I thought, was his message to conservatives about fighting, and that really seems to be, one of the things that he's going to be branding himself with. let me just I'll read you the quote that was reported. Let me tell you, Republicans, you've got to stop letting the left cow us into not doing the right thing because they're going to call us names. And being the comms guy, looking at the rhetoric and the messaging that both sides use, this is something that happens all of the time. Is that there for whatever reason the left always starts to claim that the right is mean-spirited. Right? Is that their intent is to be mean or cruel to people. That is one of their basic fundamental attacks on conservatives and on the right. And the fact is it works. It does because independents respond to it, moderates respond to it, and they don't want to be mean-spirited. Heck, conservatives don't want to be mean-spirited. And so it does cower sometimes, unfortunately, conservatives from fighting for their values and their principles because they get called names or don't want to be called names. So I thought that was a good message.
Yeah, and let me yes and that. And I don't think it's to the point where it's like we have a good faith disagreement and, there are people that, retreat to a rhetorical excess or rhetorical flourish, and that flourish then gets painted as such. What I think is the issue is that there are individuals on the left, and this does not all of them, but there are individuals on the left who just don't want the debate to happen. Mm-hmm. Because when it comes to debating the merits of something, if you have to, define your terms, like what is a woman, prior to actually engaging in a debate, then it really kind of lays bare the lack of merit many of these issues have, and it's a whole lot easier to shut down a debate than it is to actually to win in one. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of folks are. I think Governor DeSantis is absolutely correct when. There's so many well-meaning. Now, I come from the Midwest, so obviously a lot of folks in the Midwest are, nice to a fault, and they just don't like.
Is that really their reputation?
That's what I'm going to believe, at least. No, but that being said, but basically an aversion to controversy, I think we can say.
Right.
And so there's a lot of folks where they'll say, I don't want to be mean, but this seems but you know what? It really doesn't affect me directly. So why do I even really need to pay attention?
And Governor DeSantis has fought some of the biggest fights. I mean, he's fought a lot of the cultural fights and come out on the other end. And of course, he won a landslide re-election. Mm-hmm. So he is certainly one who can speak from experience that you can fight these fights, you can do the right thing, and then you can come out on the other side victorious. So just kind of getting your things are kind of warming up. I mean, it's already March. I mean, this time next year we'll have. I mean, this will be Super Tuesday. I think we'll be in the middle of it. We'll have Super Tuesday in the middle of March next year. We'll have already had Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina by now. I mean, and so things are moving that direction. What is your take on how you think the Republican primary at least is gonna shape up?
Well, I think, and again, this is just rank punditry. So buckle up.
Sure.
I
hot takes. Look out.
Exactly. I do think there is a bit more of a flavor for a populist message. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we need a conservative national industrial policy or anything radical like that. But I think that we've seen president after president really couched the power of the state in an us versus them mentality, though, of course, obviously we have much more recent examples of the state being weaponized against folks, specifically in COVID. Mm. And that's one thing that I think, that Governor DeSantis and, former President Trump, if they're both in at the same time, are going to have to square each other's rhetoric on, because one was a governor and one was a president during a time of national declared emergency. Mm-hmm. I remember reading about the Governor DeSantis's part of his speech that I stood in the way. And in doing so, stood in the way of what? Well, a lot of those were some of those policies that existed at the federal level. Now, look, you and I have talked ad nauseum about how, the federal bureaucracy is a completely unchecked, leviathan unto itself. So whether this falls, directly squarely on the shoulders of President Trump is a bit of a secondary issue. Mm-hmm. But that being said, you cannot argue that Governor DeSantis did not, push back on a lot of those excesses that even some of his own state statute allow. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's going to be a lot of examination of track records. Also, I think that the ideas that get entered into there are going to be mostly ones of a federalist bent. In other words, you're going to compare track records of states. There are going to be state records that have shown a lot of growth over the last couple of years. There's going to be state records that showed a lot of stymieing over the last couple of years. And I think that as titular figureheads of those states, the various governors that are in the race will have to answer that. Now, as far as outsiders, you mentioned, Vivek Ramaswamy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that young man, has a powerful message. It is a very common sense message. It resounds with a lot of folks. I think that's kind of this usual outsider quandary, is that he doesn't have that baked in constituency that he already has. Right. But I've just heard a lot of people say, "Oh, that guy really impresses me. That guy really impresses me," which not a lot of outsiders come in with that kind of cachet.
And the difficult thing I think for outsiders is even if they have a great message and they have a great strategy for getting on news programs and getting heard, you still have to do the brass tacks. You still have to do the nuts and bolts of campaigning, which is you have to build, particularly in the first 4 states, you have to build a field operation. You have to demonstrate the ability to raise money. I mean, I know a lot of people think that Donald Trump got into the race because he's super rich and he can say, "Oh, I don't have to worry about it." The fact is, the man raised a lot of money. He raised a lot of small donors, small dollars, which is an indication that actual human beings are willing to give you their money, which means they're willing to give you their vote. And so, even though he's a rich guy too, and he could say, "Well, money's no object, I can run," you still have to demonstrate that people support you. And the only thing we have to judge any of that right now, between now and February 1st and the Iowa caucuses, is people showing up to your events and people giving you money. And so, unless he and others, Nikki Haley and others can demonstrate that they will have actual support from real human beings and not just the ability to spend a bunch of money and get on Fox News, then it'll be difficult for them to move forward.
As our friend Senator Whiting always says, you still have to go to Tom's Ice Cream in Spirit Lake, Iowa to court the voter.
As a former senator from that great state, he would certainly know. One of the things, getting back to DeSantis's message about fighting and not being called names, that's going on right here in the Texas legislature. And of course, there's always something every legislature where the left will try and make it seem like the right is being mean-spirited about something and try to reframe it. The last few sessions, it's always been some sort of anti-gay legislation. I mean, even when I think last session when we were doing what was the pay issue for paid sick leave, instead of that issue being about whether or not workers and employers can negotiate their own benefits, that got turned into something. Oh, well, you're trying to deny gay couples from being able to treat their their partners and all of that. So there's always something there, and this year it's just gone crazy because almost it seems like there's one group who advocates for gay rights, claiming that there's 90 pieces of legislation that have been filed that are supposedly anti-gay. And I'm obviously not going to go through some of those, but I think it's worth, looking at this issue because, frankly, it's just false. I mean, I think absolutely that a number of these issues, obviously there's the bill to protect kids from these transgender surgeries and these puberty blockers and that kind of thing. Obviously, it's focused on kids, and that there's absolutely nothing about whether a kid's gay or straight or what have you. This is about protecting kids and making sure that they don't do something irreversible to them. But there's the drag shows. Again, that's about kids, not allowing them to be at these performances which are overly sexualized, highly sexualized. And then, anyway, so there's just a ton of these that have nothing to do with whether or not you're gay, and have a lot to do with, in most cases, with protecting children and making sure that they're not exposed to inappropriate, adult, highly sexualized material.
Right. No, I completely agree. And let me preface this by saying I have many friends who are gay and trans. This is one of the most pernicious practices on the left that tends to actually be abated by the media as well. Obviously, if you, again, going back to Governor DeSantis, he pushed for a bill that, kept basically sexual content out of grades 3 and below. And of course they said, oh, this is the don't say gay bill. This is the don't say gay bill. And the thing is, they make this shorthand for it, and then it gets picked up by journalists here who, again, know better that this has nothing to do with erasing people from existence or, but saying that matters of sexual nature that has never been seen as appropriate for a classroom of that age group prior to still is thus, right? And so that's one of the things where it's becoming really tiresome, and this whole thing and this whole fiction of the fact that having discussions about these issues or having any sort of decency standards that we want to have for our children is essentially leading to people committing suicide. That is just absolutely false. The fact that you don't want to have completely unproven medical experiments performed on children because their parents at the age of 3 saw them playing with the doll, not specific to their sex, is absolutely ridiculous. The idea of gender, and again, not sex, but gender as a social construct, it exists within the lifetime of people that are alive today.
Yeah.
So the fact that all of a sudden now we have folks who want to have this imperious view of you're going to refer to gender as such, and I can change it on the fly. I can call an auto, like Peyton Manning going up and calling Omaha, and now he's, Peytina Manning. That's not how this works. And the fact that you don't get to call people names for not agreeing with your, revisionist history. Not even revisionist history, revisionist account of the present.
But it goes back to your point about trying to shame people into silence, essentially, right? And I mean, 2 other bills that get called out as anti-gay all the time is, of course, the books in schools, right? Which is it's just sexualized, it's just sexual material. I mean, there's one, apologies to our audiences, but there's one that depicts a graphic rape between a man and a young girl. That's not gay. But it's also completely inappropriate for 6th graders to be having access to that to that type of content, much less having it be assigned to them by teachers. And then, of course, the other one is boys playing girls sports.
Right.
That clearly is a safety issue. I mean, in a number of different ways, but also it's also a fairness issue. I mean, again, it has absolutely nothing to do. No one is saying that gay kids can't play these sports. I mean, that of course would be an anti-gay bill. This has to do absolutely with not just safety issues, but also issues of fairness. And folks like Riley Gaines, who's become a real advocate for this, a very very courageous person to stand up for this, particularly while she's in school. That's why they're standing up for this, because this is about women's sports and protecting women's sports. So anyway, to your point again about it really is it's shameful, but it's just something we have to to DeSantis's point, you got to fight him.
Yeah,
you got to fight them on these issues.
And I would just add to the listeners who might be dispirited or might feel like, no, I don't want to fight them. It's just not worth my try. It's like, if your sense of self-worth is defined what the most zealous advocates on the other side of the issue say about you, then I mean that's this, and not even just in the sphere of public policy debate. This is not that is not a place to be. Your intrinsic sense of self-worth needs to be intrinsic.
All right. Well, we have a special, moving on to the last segment. We usually do our in-depth segment where we really break down and get into the ins and outs and the weeds of public policy. But I had an opportunity this week to sit down with a very, very interesting woman with a great story to tell. Her name is Lauren Hickmott. She is a former 6th grade teacher from Amarillo. A few years ago, she got back into education as a tutor. And almost immediately, she noticed that something was off, and that the days when she used to teach academics, something was very, very different. For starters, the math homework looked a lot like the old Common Core curriculum, which apparently, as we know, it was banned in Texas during all of that time. So it started, that was kind of her first red flag. The second one, which was even stranger, was that kids weren't bringing their reading assignments home. So they were only doing the reading assignments at school, and so it was odd that that wasn't going to be part of what she helped kids with. So she started asking questions, and frankly, she was appalled. And we all kind of know where the story is going. She was appalled at what she found going on in her schools. I taped an interview with Lauren from my other podcast that you can download and subscribe to called Brian's Breakdown. You can also find that on YouTube or iTunes and Google Play. So for in-depth, I want to share the portion of Lauren's story right now. Here, check it out. What was kind of the first thing that said, something's off here?
Well, this past September, we started a new math curriculum called Eureka. And it was the most confusing way to present math I've ever seen. I was like, this is Common Core curriculum math, and which is illegal in the state of Texas. And
I haven't heard that in a long time. Common Core.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So I was very frustrated with Eureka. And at the time, we also, Amarillo had started using new reading curriculum called Amplify Reading. And I hadn't heard anything about Amplify. Nothing had come home with my kids. And so parents were clueless. Like, nothing was coming home. I have friends with younger kids, and they were saying that books were no longer coming home. And they used to always get books home to read with their kids, and you know how you do your little reading log.
Sure, yeah.
Books were not coming home, and it just kind of was weird. But like, we were trusting our school because we love our school and we love our teachers, and so we just kind of felt like Amarillo was in a bubble, like. What all the woke mess in the rest of the country has not hit us yet.
Sure.
That's what we were thinking.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Anyway, so we, so it was just nothing was coming home. And so, but this was early September when I first found out about what was going on. And so that's when I started doing some research.
Did they outlaw homework?
They weren't having homework. Like, at least my son wasn't. He was in 4th grade.
And I've, you talk to enough parents, that's a real opportunity as a parent, not only to see what's going on in schools and all of that, to see what they're learning, but an opportunity to help, an opportunity to facilitate and to reinforce the lessons that are being taught in the classroom at home, making sure that they're being done. And so that's a head scratcher. That's going to be a real red flag for a lot of parents.
Like, plenty of math homework. Like, that took forever. And I mean, we loved each other, but we didn't always like each other because I was trying to teach him the right way to do it, But no, it was a lot of math homework, but no reading. Like, I saw nothing from Amplify. It wasn't even on my radar.
So you start to get a little bit more involved. Tell us about, what was the actions that you took to figure out why the books weren't coming home.
So, I ran into another mom at her garage sale, and she said, "Have you heard about the guava passage that they did and that our kids read?" And I was like, "No." So she started telling me about it, and I was like, "You've got to be kidding," because it was just super inappropriate.
Guava, like the fruit guava.
Guava, the fruit, yes, which is other things apparently. So I did some research. I got access and specifically started looking at 4th grade because that's where my son is. And so I found the guava passage that had been talked about. Second day of school, they did a passage called A Good Lie that talked about, and it literally said in quotes, "Sometimes it's okay to lie." And so it was teaching kids about protecting this little girl, protecting her friend who wet the bed at a slumber party. And then she was pretending she wet the bed too. And I'm like, that's weird. Why are we reading about that? That's just weird. And then just saying.
The subject matter, but then also the lesson.
Yes, the lesson. It says sometimes it's okay to lie. And then one time we were getting on to my son and my 4th grader about something he didn't tell the truth on. And he said, "Well, sometimes it's okay to lie." I said, "No, sir." I mean, because he knows better than that. He was just pulling one that he, heard at school. So it's just that undermining parents and like we hadn't had access.
I want to get to that in a second, but I think you've had our audience at the edge of their seat now teasing this guava passage.
Yes.
Like, to the best of your ability and not to use graphic language necessarily, but can you explain exactly, or, for our audience what that was?
Yeah. So it was the beginning of an adult book called When I Was a Puerto Rican. And it's this lady writing about, I guess, when she came to the United States from Puerto Rico as a little girl. And she opens up the book talking about how to eat a guava. And it is very just sensory, like just very graphic. And they even in the teacher lesson plan, it's scripted. It said to have a student at the front of the classroom, like holding a guava and actually acting out and fingering the guava as this other student or the teacher read this passage.
And it's all very sexual in nature. And
oh yes. And if you look it up on Urban Dictionary, I mean, it tells you what a guava represents.
So now you found out, now you've gotten sort of behind the wall, and you're starting to see this material, you're now confirming it, your son's coming home with the material. Was there any attempt to then take this to the teachers who were there? You said there were some teachers who felt very uncomfortable about it, and maybe they were talking about it on social media. What about the people in charge?
Well, Amarillo ISD hosted a few town hall meetings because there had already.
You're doing that in finger quotes for those who are listening.
So I showed up. I was the only parent at this specific meeting. But like I said, nobody knew this is where you go to talk about it. We just thought it was going to be, or at least that was my understanding. So when I told this lady, I said I was told this was a place to come and I could talk about my concerns about one of the passages my son was exposed to. She goes, "Don't tell me it's about that freaking guava." And I said, "Yes, it is." And so
sounds like she's heard that before.
Oh yeah.
Heard that complaint before.
And she was tired of hearing it, but we discussed it again, and she said, the kids were not exposed to the rest of the book. And I said, it doesn't matter. I said, you've connected these kids to that.
There's not another book where they could use that,
teach
that lesson, whatever.
That's what I asked. I said, I guarantee you, in all of children's literature, there was an appropriate book to teach about sensory details that was not that. But I just think it shouldn't take us getting this upset to have anything like listened to or changed. I know the huge group of us parents and teachers have spoken at our local board meetings, just trying to get things moving on this. But I just, as far as like the legislators, I think it's important to listen to parents. And I do think parents, absolutely want what's best for their kids. I know my kids, and I would love for my kids to be able to stay in public school. But if that trust isn't there, then my kids are not going to be there. And I feel like our local school district has lost a lot of parents' trust. We pulled our kids out at semester, and I quit my job for the district at semester, and we found a free public
because of these reasons.
Because of these reasons.
Okay, that's an important point. Is that you weren't just making a shift.
No, we didn't want to. There were a lot of tears and a lot of prayer, and we did not want to. And my kids have been awesome sports about it, and have they're struggled, but they've been great sports. But it just is one of those things. When we met with, we were told that we would have options. Amarillo ISD said, okay, well, we're going to clean it up. We're going to go ahead and vet the curriculum. And that was the thing, is it wasn't vetted before. And they said it was because they piloted it in these 3 elementary schools. And they said, we never heard anything bad about it. Well, that's not true, because at a recent board meeting, one of the teachers who had spoken up against it and was let go, she spoke up about it and said, this is what happened to me when I tried to speak out against it.
When she was fired?
I don't know how exactly it played out, but she was not at the school anymore after she spoke out. So I don't know if they moved her or whatever happened, but her life was made miserable. She was out because she spoke against it. And that was during the piloting process. So when parents started speaking up, our superintendent said this was the first time he had ever heard anything negative about this new curriculum. And so I don't know how all that worked out, but I do know that he's hearing warnings now, and their solution was like, well, let's just take out the parts of the curriculum that are getting the most heat. Well, that's not going to fix it, because the cancer is throughout. And like I told him, I said, it's like you're not going to load up a bunch of passengers on a plane that's malfunctioning and then read the manual about how to fix it while they're in the air. I said, that's exactly what's going on. I said, you need to ground the plane, you need to scrap it, and figure out something else, because this isn't, like, we know that this is untrustworthy.
Right.
And so there have been the waiting lists at the optional schools in Amarillo, besides public schools, have exploded because parents are catching on, the word is spreading, and we've lost trust. There's going to be a mass exodus of teachers as well. Like, I'm friends with a lot of teachers just all over the district, and they're not happy. Now, I will say there are some teachers that love Amplify. They think it's wonderful because of the rigor and because of the like pre-made kind of lesson planning,
Sure.
Which, being a teacher, I get. Like, it's hard to reinvent the wheel every day. Like, I get that. And you don't always have to, but sometimes it just is a lot of work. But at the same time, like, not at this cost. This isn't, surely there's a better curriculum out there that is more rigorous than what we had before, because what we had before was not working. But not at this cost, though.
So I hate to go out on a bad note, so I won't do that. But I'll say it sounds at least like you've been able to make a change, make a different choice. How do you think if lawmakers did change the law and gave parents more choice, how do you think that would work out for most parents?
I think, I don't, like I said, I don't know all the ins and outs, but I can personally just say for me, it sounds like a good plan. Because like I said, parents know their kids and know what's best for their kids. And I mean, I think it would be great if they just the government just didn't take our money out in the first place and then redistribute it into education. If they just let us have it to begin with, I think that'd be great.
And you can decide what
yes,
you do with
yes. But I mean, I'm not a legislator, so I don't know. But yeah, I think that competition would be helpful for schools to kind of hopefully up their game and do better, because right now I feel like the school districts aren't very afraid. Maybe they are, but I feel like they're continuing forward even though they've had all this backlash. So I think giving parents a choice is a good thing.
You're busy, you're working hard, you're raising your family, and you don't have to know all the ins and outs necessarily of this legislation, but your story is incredibly powerful for moving in the right direction when it comes to these bills and these reforms. So thank you so much for what you do. Again, we've been talking with Lauren Hickmott of Amarillo. She's a teacher. She's a very concerned parent, and she's out here again talking to folks as a warning to parents about what's going on in the schools, but also as motivation to lawmakers to get out there and do the right thing. Lauren, thank you so much for
parents to pay attention.
If you want to hear the full interview, again, it's on my podcast called Brian's Breakdown, available on iTunes, Google Play, and all the major services. Thank you again for watching The Right Idea, and as always, do good and suffer the consequences.